Test. Pass. Fail. Hmm. Welcome to the 102nd episode of the Henry George A. Devotional. We continue in Book 10, Chapter 1. Book 10 is the Law of Human Progress. Chapter 1, the current theory of human progress, its insufficiency. Um, yeah, I think last time George basically said that the idea that each successive generation has somehow hereditarily improved um, doesn't account for a lot of civilizations that reach a certain point and then just stagnate. And the other explanation of innate capacity also doesn't seem to, what's the word, hold water? Is that a, yeah, the reason it doesn't hold water. Also because we look at all these other far away older civilizations that arose and then crumbled, and it sure seems like any old race, quote unquote race, can achieve progress. I'm sure if you, I don't know, it's sort of, there's some sort of like symmetry seeking in me that wishes I knew of some like ancient high level African civilization. But I guess since we all came from Africa, you could sort of, I don't know. Um, yeah, do we know, has there ever been a highly developed African ancient. Oh, well, Egypt. That's so funny. I mean, I think of Egypt as like the Middle East. The kingdom of Aksum. So, you say Egypt, you have then China, you have Inca, Mayan, and then Germanic or whatever, and Rome. I don't know, man. Not a history major. Alright. George writes, one of the best popular expounders of the development philosophy, Walter Baggio. Should we find out how to actually say this guy's name? We've read it before.
Budget.
Badgett. Alright, fine. Sometimes those are not the common pronunciation, but anyway. Walter Bagehot, Physics and Politics, admits the force of this objection, one of the best popular and endeavors in this way to explain it. Alright, I'm not exactly sure. Well, let's just hear his explanation. That the first thing necessary to civilize man is to tame him, to induce him to live in association with his fellows, in subordination to law, and hence a body or cake of laws and customs grows up. Being intensified and extended by natural selection, the tribe or nation thus bound together having an advantage over those who are not. That this cake of custom and law finally becomes too thick and hard to permit further progress, which can go on only as circumstances occur which introduce discussion and thus permit the freedom and mobility necessary to improvement. This explanation, which Mr. Bagehot offers, as he says, with some misgivings. Oh, that's kind of interesting. This guy actually said he's not sure about it. This explanation is, I think, at the expense of the general theory, but it is not worthwhile speaking of that, for it manifestly does not explain the facts. Alright, this guy proposes you have to tame wild man and induce him to live in association with others, and that, I guess, is done by offering this advantage. The advantage of working together or under a body of laws is the reason that they work together. Yeah. And then this idea that this cake gets baked and is hard uh, limits the association. The hardening tendency of which Mr. Bagehot speaks would show itself at a very early period of development, and his illustrations of it are nearly all drawn from savage or semi-savage life. Whereas these arrested civilizations had gone a long distance before they stopped. There must have been a time when they were very far advanced as compared with the savage state, and were yet plastic, free and advancing, and yet were yet plastic, free and okay. There must have been a time when they were very far advanced as compared with the savage state, and were yet plastic, free and advancing. Okay, so these customs hadn't calcified, is the moment we're thinking about. These arrested civilizations stopped at a point which was hardly in anything inferior and in many respects superior to European civilization of, say, the 16th, or at any rate the 15th century. So, okay, a lot of these ancient civilizations got up to 15th or 16th century European civilization. Up to that point, then, there must have been discussion, the hailing of what was new, and mental activity of all sorts. They had architects who carried the art of building, necessarily by a series of innovations or improvements up to a very high point. Shipbuilders who in the same way, by innovation after innovation, finally produced as good a vessel as the warships of Henry VIII. Inventors who stopped only on the verge of our most important improvements, and from some of whom we can yet learn. Engineers who constructed great irrigation works and navigable canals, rival schools of philosophy and conflicting ideas of religion. One great religion in many respects, resembling Christianity, rose in India, displaced the old religion, passed into China, sweeping over that country, and was displaced again in its old seats, just as Christianity was displaced in its first seats. There was life, and active life, and the innovation that begets improvement, long after men had learned to live together. And moreover, both India and China have received the infusion of new life in conquering races, with different customs and modes of thought. Yeah, I remember when I read this the first time, it was you're like, duh. There was a time when Egypt, for instance, I think he likes to really talk a lot about Egypt. Yep, he's about to talk about Egypt. Uh, didn't have hieroglyphs and really cool headdresses, and didn't know how to mummify their pharaohs, and didn't know how to build pyramids, and they had to progress. It's sort of because you see the peak of these civilizations gets, I don't know, fossilized in our museums, that I have this tendency to think of them being everlastingly at this level of development, and yet that cannot be so. And now I'm also curious about somebody tell me what were these religions that resembled Christianity that rose in India? I mean, Hinduism, I guess, or and then it was displaced. And is it like Christianity was displaced in its first seats? I guess. I guess because they went back to Judaism in Israel, whereas I don't know. Greek and Italy sure stayed pretty Christian. Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians. Anyway, this point that there was a lot of improvement after men had learned to live together, that initial taming of the savage state, that there was still much, much progress after they got tamed. All right. George writes, the most fixed and petrified of all civilizations of which we know anything was that of Egypt. Yeah, this is what I half remember. Where even art finally assumed a conventional and inflexible form, but we know that behind this must have been a time of life and vigor, a freshly developing and expanding civilization such as ours is now, or the arts and sciences could never have been carried to such a pitch. And recent excavations have brought to light from beneath what we before knew of Egypt and earlier Egypt still, in statues and carvings, which, instead of a hard and formal type, beam with life and expression which show art struggling, ardent, natural, and free, the sure indication of an active and expanding life. So it must have been once with all now unprogressive civilizations. The funny thing is, 1930s Egyptology. Um, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. Latest discovery of Aristotle scroll. Researchers have just read a new scroll. Oh yeah, I remember when this was. Um, dang. Democracy creative. What I'm looking for is. I don't think it's here. Historical roots. Part 2, historical roots. Let's see. Egypt is not in this one. Aristotle. That's the only. Alright, I don't know. We'll keep going. But basically, I thought I read that in the early 20th century, like maybe not the 1920s or 30s, we learned a lot more about Egypt, including also we learned more about ancient Athens. We found some evidence of their using sortition. So in George's time, he would not have known some of these things, which is interesting to me. And we do continue to find more and more ancient history, which is also interesting to me. All right, we will continue here. Let's see. Will we try to finish this? Oof. Maybe. George writes, but it is not merely these arrested civilizations that the current theory of development fails to account for. It is not merely that men have gone so far on the path of progress and then stopped. It is that men have gone far on the path of progress and then gone back. It is not merely an isolated case that thus confronts the theory. It is the universal rule. Yeah, and yet the net progress of humans is increasing. We are more progressed now than we ever have been. And you might argue that we are continually, each civilization is a little more just than the previous one, often. And so, I don't know, some forms of justice might have been lost, but I don't know. Every civilization that the world has yet seen has had its period of vigorous growth, of arrest and stagnation, its decline and fall. Of all the civilizations that have arisen and flourished, there remain today but those that have been arrested, and our own, which is not yet as old as were the pyramids when Abraham looked upon them, while behind the pyramids were 20 centuries of recorded history. When were the pyramids built? Yeah, man. Isn't that, we have to remember this. 4,000-ish years ago, 4,000 years ago, they built the pyramids. That our own civilization has a broader base is of a more advanced type, moves quicker and soars higher than any preceding civilization is undoubtedly true. But in these respects it is hardly more in advance of the Greco-Roman civilization than it was in advance of Asiatic civilization. And if it were, that would prove nothing as to its permanence and future advance, unless it be shown that it is superior in those things which caused the ultimate failure of its predecessors. The current theory does not assume this. Yeah, the current theory only says that, we have this cake of customs and rules that become inflexible. Um, the current theory doesn't really say anything about whether this current form is superior. In truth, nothing could be further from explaining the facts of universal history than this theory that civilization is the result of a course of natural selection which operates to improve and elevate the powers of man. That civilization has arisen at different times in different places and has progressed at different rates is not inconsistent with this theory, for that might result from the unequal balancing of impelling and resisting forces. But that progress everywhere commencing, for even among the lowest tribes it is held that there has been some progress, has nowhere been continuous, but has everywhere been brought to a stand or retrogression, is absolutely inconsistent. For if progress operated to fix an improvement in man's nature, and thus to produce further progress, though there might be occasional interruption, yet the general rule would be that progress would be continuous, that advance would lead to advance, and civilization develop into higher civilization. Not merely the general rule, but the universal rule is the reverse of this. The earth is the tomb of the dead empires, no less than of dead men. Instead of progress fitting men for greater progress, every civilization that was in its own time as vigorous and advancing as ours is now, has of itself come to a stop. Over and over again art has declined, learning sunk, power waned, population become sparse, until the people who had built great temples and mighty cities, turned rivers and pierced mountains, cultivated the earth like a garden and introduced the utmost refinement into the minute affairs of life, remained but in a remnant of squalid barbarians who had lost even the memory of what their ancestors had done, and regarded the surviving fragments of their grandeur as the work of genii, or of the mighty race before the flood. So true is this that when we think of the past it seems like the inexorable law from which we can no more hope to be exempt than the young man who feels his life in every limb can hope to be exempt from the dissolution which is the common fate of all. Even this, O Rome, must one day be thy fate, wept Scipio over the ruins of Carthage, and Macaulay's picture of the New Zealander musing upon the broken arch of London Bridge appeals to the imagination of even those who see cities rising in the wilderness and help to lay the foundations of new empire. And so, when we erect a public building, we make a hollow in the largest cornerstone and carefully seal within it some mementos of our day, looking forward to the time when our works shall be ruins and ourselves forgot. Hmm. I think I'm probably going to end it there. I mean, when I think about all this, I think of a few different systems that could sort of possibly have existed. This idea of a singular civilization that continually progresses. In that way, we wouldn't be left with these skeletons of other civilizations. But short of that, how sort of like how else could progress take hold? And it's sort of weird to think about that. Um, it's hard to think of other ways other than what has happened with different civilizations arising, stagnating, falling, and then other civilizations sort of starting over. There could always be some aliens that show up. You don't really see many fusing of great civilizations very often. At least not in the. I mean, you could argue that whatever arises afterwards or something. Or you could argue that when one civilization sort of conquers another, it fuses a bit. I don't know. It seems strange to think that we could establish a civilization or get to some point. Like, are we just waiting for one civilization to progress so far that it breaks through some level of social technology that then it can be this utopian Star Trek everlasting human civilization that takes over the rest of the galaxy? Or are we just setting up for Star Wars with the Empire and the Rebellion? And is that always the fate? I mean, Progress and Poverty and George's claims, his claims do tend to be of the type where it's like it is solved. And if we were to have all these policies in place, there would be continuous progress. Of course, George would admit that were these policies ever removed, um, then everything would revert. I guess that's sort of what he's saying. sort of de facto is what happened in a lot of these civilizations where there was a lot of justice and fairness and people received the fruits of their labor. And then it came to be dominated by certain smaller groups, and the justice, uh, there was no more justice, and so the civilization stagnated and fell. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Poe took me to here. We want podcasters. HGDD 102. All right. Um, the cake theory disproved. The progress, the highest forms of progress are not due to incremental increases, but from different empires arising, peaking, and falling. This does not match the current theories, says George. George, George, George of the city, strong as he can be. Not made for kids. All set. Why? This didn't get published yesterday? Damn, damn, damn. There it is. Oh, getting a lot of views here. Whoa. I'm I never know what you're referring to. Oh, what? I never. Hmm? LVT is my religion, sort of. Uh, which you could argue was due to geographical reason, I suppose. What was our most ancient so in the then Egypt isn't too far. Asia isn't too far. Wait, what part of Africa did we all come from? The Horn of Africa. Do I follow the Christian dimension of Henry George? Not super closely. I mean, I know that he himself seemed to want to de-emphasize the dogmatic or the like a biblical connection somewhat, but I grew up in a very um I guess, dogmatic or very Christian home. And so I see a lot of connections. I do like calling George's writings the social gospel. Alright, so it does say we sort of started down here, I guess. Alright, I don't know. Yeah. You think you ramped up the religious aspect? I mean, I'm reading through Land and Liberty, Henry George, and the Forming of Modern Liberalism. I'm reading this book, um, The Crafting of Modern Liberalism, and I've been taking like extensive notes, but it definitely is sort of minimal on explicit Christianity. Wait, Chris, what? You Christopher William England is a Marxist? Um, I mean he is very sympathetic towards Georgism. He was one, now he veers Georgist. Interesting. Yeah, I've met a few of those people along that path. I come from a more libertarian background, but also non-academic. Um, hmm. Alright, so this I take back. Like part of me looks at this whole thing and is like, isn't this exactly what everybody thinks? You know, humans evolved in Africa, they were nomadic, then they were able to find some places that were very favorable towards agriculture. You reckon he wouldn't connect with H.E.'s Christian motivation because he got many arguments from the Bible? Well, you might be right that he is downplaying the Christian origin of George's thoughts. I mean, I myself, you know, I don't know how Christian the physiocrats were. Of course, George sort of was independent of that. I don't know, Thomas Paine didn't really, and Adam Smith, they didn't really cite a whole bunch of verses in the Bible. Why nomadic? Why leave Africa? Surely people were forcibly expelled from Africa. Well, as far as I don't know of, I mean, are people nomadic, or is there like a tribalism and a territorialism, and you wouldn't call that nomadic? I don't know, but how would we know if they were forcibly expelled or they were just seeking other land and spreading out because they foraged and hunted and needed more land? I don't know how you would know unless there were some, huge amount of ruins found in South Africa with a bunch of documents. HG got famous because of the Irish Land War, which saw a schism in the Catholic Church on the issue of land reform. Yes, and that is covered in the Land and Liberty book. A lot of talk about Father McGlynn getting like kicked out by the Catholic higher ups. I sort of haven't, I don't recall exactly how that all got resolved. Um, and then there's a bunch of talks now about Williams Jennings Bryan's would be a what's it called? Better as a pastor than as a more than a Georgist. It simply makes sense through population growth that people would be expelled. Okay, I mean I just wouldn't like think of it that way. Like if a civilization is based around foraging and hunting and that behavior, um, yeah, I could see how, you could call it being expelled, but it was just like probably the normal way that that society just behaved. Every few generations, people had to go seek new land. It's a little bit different than somebody setting down like permanent roots. When I hear the term expelled, I think of something different. Thus, Africa owes the world reparations. Yeah. Uh, I don't think I don't think the land value tax should be very high in a lot of Africa these days. Yeah, I knew you were joking. All right, see you later. Um, I don't, yeah, like, it's funny how this, somehow reading this makes it sound like it's some brilliant theory, but it's like, you just looked at the history of humans and then said it was like causal instead of descriptive. I don't know. Yeah, so I want to find this. Damn. The classical Athenians best known was the ecclesia, their mass assembly, like Ecclesiastes. Around 6,000 and a population. Sortition was sacrosanct. The practice of drawing lots long predated the invention of Greek democracy. For example, Athens did not practice primogeniture inheritance, where they also so lotteries were used to distribute inheritance. In Athens, the lottery was a practical human tool, rather than as in some other cultures being viewed as a way of letting the gods decide. Malkin 2023. Wait, where's the next button? No Athens here. What about Greek? Damn, man. Chapter 3, Electoral Imperatives. this. Okay, this was in the late 19th century. Constitution of Athens. Translated. So it was found in 1890. How do I post a comment? Welcome to the 102nd episode of the Henry George A. Devotion. The Aristotelian text is unique because it is not part of the Corpus Aristotelicum as preserved through medieval manuscripts. It was lost until 2 leaves of a papyrus codex carrying part of the text were discovered in the Fayum in 1879 and published in 1880. Progress and Poverty was published in 1879. A second, more extensive papyrus text was purchased in Egypt by an American missionary in 1890. E. A. Wallace Budge of the British Museum acquired it later that year, and the first edition of it by Frederick G. Kenyon was published in 1891. The editions of the Greek text in widest use today are Kenyon's Oxford Classical Text, 1920, and Tubner. It's now in the British Library. Ancient accounts of Aristotle credit him with 558 constitutions of various states. It is widely assumed that these were research for the politics, and that many of them were written or drafted by his students. Athens, however, was a particularly important state, and where Aristotle was living at the time. Therefore, it is plausible that even if students composed the others, Aristotle composed that one himself as a model for the rest. On the other hand, a number of prominent scholars doubt that it was written by Aristotle. If it is a genuine writing of Aristotle, then it is of particular significance because it is the only one of his extant writings that was actually intended for publication, because it purports to supply so much contemporary information previously unknown or unreliable. Modern historians have claimed that the discovery of this treatise constitutes almost a new epoch in Greek historical study. On the work of the work contained factual. Yeah, what's so funny is all the study I've done of early American history and all the study I've done of ancient Greek is I never realized that all of like, I don't know how you call it, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century thought did not have access to this. So I mean, I spent a lot of time studying the, American founders and the founding of democracy, and then it's just so funny to hear that they didn't actually know a lot about um, Greece. However, I've also learned that the American founding fathers, it just doesn't seem like they were that super interested in Greek democracy. That's sort of a bit of a, I don't know about a myth, but it's a popular idea doesn't seem to hold up as strongly as you thought as a child. The constitutions of the Athenians describes the political system of ancient Athens. It consists of two parts: Alcmenodiae, Alcmeonidae until the fall of the 30, oligarchy, restoration of democracy in 403 BC. The 30 only lasted for a year. The lost beginning, which is not preserved but survives only Hell and the epitome, or in the epitome of Heraclitus, Lembus dealt with migration of Ion, the creation of Philae, Trities, and Phratres, and the kingship of Pandion, the democratic reform of Theseus, the death of Theseus, the change from a monarchy to some elected archons under the Codrid dynasty, the cruelty of Hippomenes, the conspiracy of Cylon, the festival of Hephaestus. If you feel like you ought to read it, these ancient humans, man. The democracy of Athens evolved over time. It is common to imagine Athenian democracy persisting as it existed from the time of Pericles, in the time of Pericles for some 200 years. In fact, there were counter-revolutions and brief periods of oligarchy followed by democratic restoration. Many scholars link the birth of democracy in Athens to the reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 BC. After he led the overthrow of the tyrant Hippias, Cleisthenes was exiled by a competitor, Isagoras, with the help of the Spartan army. The people rose up against Isagoras and his Spartan allies and pursued spontaneous revolution. Welcome back, Cleisthenes, perhaps in order to shore up his position as leader against Isagoras and other potential aristocratic rivals. Cleisthenes launched an astonishingly comprehensive social engineering to divide the former Council of 400, change 500. After Civil War, agreement with the Athenian with justice system and better the law. Yeah, this is what we just read about. The reforms of the Athenian democracy stripped the power to adopt laws from the assembly and gave that power to large, randomly selected representative panels of citizens, nomothetai. The assembly retained final authority in certain matters, such as foreign policy, short-term decrees, and decisions about war and peace. The assembly could only order that a legislative body be impaneled to consider a particular law. The Council of 500, the courts, and most administrative magistrates were also filled by lot. As they had been in the first Athenian democracy, Athens even instituted compensation for participating in government meetings. Equality meant that all male citizens had the actual rather than merely theoretical opportunity to govern, and be governed in turn. The random selection, short-term or not against concentration of power and ensuing corruption and risk of tyranny by an elite. The Ephesians limited the use of elections to a few unique offices for which they were specialized, such as military generals. When did Aristotle? 384 to 322 BC. It goes what? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle is just the man. Did Aristotle tutor Alexander? Hmm. Alright, where did I even leave off? Polarization and groupthink. The end. Uh-oh. I may have mislabeled my videos.
For the past few weeks, Randall White has been dealing with a persistent the weeks ago after he was woken up around 4 a.m.
Then it happened again and again, and I started thinking, well, this is an issue.
White isn't the only one who's had issues with the noises either. Several people who live in the buildings nearby the parking lot have also had similar complaints.
For the past 2 weeks, I've been woken up more times overnight than I have combined over 20 years.
Russell Pofsky lives in a building adjacent to White. He says the honking incidents have happened at random times during both the day and night and have started to take a toll on him.
I could not be more cranky today.
7 News, we briefly honk while navigating our parking lots. We have identified the cause and are in the process of implementing a fix. White says Monday afternoon was the first.
They're plotting with each other. That's pretty good. Alright, here we go. Groupthink. Polarization. In a deliberative situation. I think I'm gonna stop the stream.